It was an ordinary evening in late October when the world was about to witness something unexpected. Fans of Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had been waiting for this moment for years. The announcement came on social media. The two stars, who had captured hearts worldwide in their iconic roles in Speed, were going to reunite on a popular late-night talk show for a special interview. The excitement was palpable. People across the globe marked their calendars. The show, known for its bold and often controversial approach to interviews, had already set the stage for an intense evening. What people didn't know, however, was that the host had a plan that wasn't just about celebrating the actor's achievements. No, this time the goal was to push buttons, get reactions, and create a moment that would leave everyone talking. It had been over 2 decades since Keanu and Sandra had shared the screen, but their bond from filming Speed had always remained strong. Fans adored them not only for their on-screen chemistry, but for the genuine friendship they seemed to share in real life. Even the most cynical critics couldn't help but love them. Both were known for being kind, humble, and above all down-to-earth despite their fame. When the announcement was made, social media exploded. Fans posted nostalgic photos of the two stars on set, discussing their favorite scenes from Speed and hoping for some behind-the-scenes stories. Everyone was eager to hear what they had been up to over the years. The show's producers knew this reunion would be a goldmine, and it would surely be a night to remember. But as much as the fans were excited, there were whispers behind the scenes that the night might not go according to plan. The host of the show, who had made a name for himself by pushing boundaries and getting under the skin of his guests, had a reputation for asking difficult, sometimes uncomfortable questions. It wasn't going to be a typical feel-good conversation. The producers knew this and were already preparing for what was likely to be a bumpy ride. When the night of the interview finally arrived, the atmosphere backstage was a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Keanu and Sandra arrived early, as they often did, ready to talk and share their experiences. They were both casually dressed, looking relaxed and comfortable, as if they were about to chat with old friends instead of sitting under the glaring spotlight of a live audience. There was no hint of the drama that was about to unfold. The set was buzzing with activity. Cameras were being adjusted, makeup artists were giving last-minute touch-ups, and the crew was running through their final rehearsals. It was the usual chaos that came before any live taping, but for some reason the air felt different this time. There was a certain tension that couldn't quite be shaken. As Keanu and Sandra were led to their seats on the stage, the host was already waiting, sitting confidently behind his desk. His sharp suit and wide smile gave the impression that he was about to entertain, not just interview. The audience clapped, welcoming the stars with thunderous applause. It felt like a warm reunion, the kind of moment everyone had hoped for. Sandra waved to the crowd, a bright smile on her face, and Keanu nodded politely, his usual calm demeanor in full display. The host wasted no time in launching into the first question. "You two have been through quite a lot together, huh?" he said, his tone already teasing. "What was it like working with each other back in the day?" Both stars leaned forward, eager to share their experiences. They smiled at each other, remembering the days on set of Speed. It wasn't an easy film to make, but it was one that had forged an undeniable bond between them. Keanu spoke first, reminiscing about the crazy stunts they did and the camaraderie they shared during long shoots. Sandra followed, laughing at some of the wild behind-the-scenes moments, like when the two of them had to pretend to be terrified while driving at high speeds on a moving bus. The crowd laughed along with them, their chemistry undeniable. It seemed like everything was going smoothly, but just when the audience thought they were going to hear some heartwarming, funny stories, the host shifted gears. "Tell me," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Was it hard working with someone who, let's face it, isn't the most lively guy on set?" Sandra blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. Keanu, ever composed, didn't flinch. He simply chuckled softly. "I think Sandra and I had a great time," he replied, his voice calm and measured. "We were both there to do our best work, and that's what we focused on." The host didn't let it go. "But seriously, Keanu," he continued, leaning forward, "you're known for being, well, let's say reserved. You don't exactly come off as the life of the party. How did you handle the intense atmosphere on set?" The audience grew tense. The laughter died down as the words hung in the air. Sandra, who had been smiling just moments ago, now had a slightly confused look on her face. Keanu didn't seem fazed at all, though. He smiled in his usual gentle way and responded, "I guess I've always been more focused on the work than on being a showman." There was an uncomfortable pause before the host tried to lighten the mood with a joke. "And what about you, Sandra? Did you have to keep the energy up on set? I imagine you were the one keeping Keanu awake." Sandra's expression faltered for a split second before she broke into a polite but strained laugh. "I don't know if I was keeping him awake, but I definitely think we balanced each other out," she said, her tone a little more defensive now. "We're very different people, but that's what made working together so much fun. We were always in sync when it mattered." The host smiled, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, but he didn't let up. Right, he said, nodding. "But come on, let's be real. You two must have had some tension. You know, the kind of unspoken drama that always follows famous on-screen couples? There it was. The question that no one had expected. It was as if the host was pushing for some kind of scandalous answer. He was no longer interested in the charm of the speed reunion. No, he was digging for dirt. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was a line no one had wanted crossed. Sandra's smile faded slightly, and Keanu's calm facade remained unchanged. They exchanged a quick look, both sensing the shift in tone. This wasn't the fun conversation they had signed up for. They had come here to share their love for the work they had done together, to reflect on the years that had passed, and to give the audience something to enjoy. But it felt like the host wasn't interested in that. He was looking for conflict, drama, and maybe even a fight. The camera zoomed in on both of them, and the room felt unnervingly still. Everyone was waiting to see how they would respond. What would they say to the host's probing questions? Would they confront him? Would they leave the stage? Or would they continue to sit there and smile, pretending that everything was okay? The show had only just begun, and already it was clear this wouldn't be the feel-good reunion everyone had imagined. Something was about to happen, something unexpected. The energy in the room had changed. The usual lively atmosphere that accompanied the reunion of two beloved stars had shifted to something a lot more tense. The host, sensing that he had hit a nerve, didn't back down. Instead, he pressed harder. His questions, once lighthearted, now took a much sharper tone. "Come on," the host said, leaning forward with an almost predatory smile. "It's all well and good to talk about chemistry on set, but let's get real here. There must have been some kind of tension, right? You two were so close. You were practically inseparable on screen. How does that not create some kind of drama behind the scenes?" Keanu and Sandra exchanged another quick glance. It was clear that neither of them was expecting this line of questioning. Sandra's smile, which had been so warm at the start of the interview, now seemed tight. She took a deep breath, clearly choosing her words carefully. "I think when you work with someone for that long, there's bound to be some challenges," she began, her voice steady. But there was a hint of a defensive edge to it now. "But it was always professional. We respected each other. The work came first." The audience sat in silence, waiting for the next move. They could sense the tension. It was as if everyone knew the host had gone too far, but they weren't sure what would happen next. Would Sandra call him out? Would Keanu speak up? Or would they both just let it slide? But the host wasn't finished. He seemed to thrive on the discomfort. He leaned in even closer, his eyes focused intently on Sandra. "I get it," he said, his tone almost mocking now. "But working with someone for so long, I mean, you two were pretty much attached at the hip on set. How did you deal with that closeness? Don't tell me there was no underlying tension, no unspoken feelings." At this point, the audience shifted in their seats. There was an uncomfortable murmur. People didn't know what to think. Was the host being deliberately provocative, or was he genuinely curious? Either way, it was clear that the situation was becoming increasingly awkward. Sandra's face tightened, but she didn't back down. "Look," she said, her voice still calm but with a noticeable firmness. "Keanu and I have been through a lot together, but there was never any unspoken tension. We were just two people doing our jobs. If there was something personal going on, we handled it, but we were always professional." Keanu, who had remained mostly quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. His voice was soft but steady, and there was a quiet authority in his words. "I think people often forget that just because two people spend a lot of time together, it doesn't mean they have to be in each other's faces all the time," he said, glancing at Sandra before looking back at the host. "We were friends. We respected each other. That was the most important thing. The host's smile faded slightly. Clearly, he hadn't expected this response. But he wasn't ready to let it go. He pushed further. Sure, he said, his tone becoming a bit sharper. But you can't deny the fact that there were rumors about the two of you over the years. I mean, you guys were basically Hollywood's most beloved couple on and off the screen. How did you handle the press? Did it ever get to you? Sandra's expression flickered for just a second and she took a deep breath. The questions were becoming too personal, too invasive. This wasn't the conversation they had signed up for. She glanced over at Keanu, who, as always, remained calm and composed. She could see the slight tension in his shoulders, but he wasn't giving the host the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. We didn't pay much attention to the rumors, Sandra said, her tone firm but controlled. It was part of the job. The media will always try to create stories, but at the end of the day we knew what was real. And that's what mattered to us. Keanu nodded in agreement. Exactly, he added. When you're in this industry long enough, you learn not to take things personally. People will always talk, but you can't let that define your relationships. We had each other's backs, and that's all that mattered. The host raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by how composed they were in the face of his attempts to stir up drama. It was clear that his plan wasn't going exactly how he'd imagined. Instead of creating tension between them, Keanu and Sandra were only growing stronger in their responses. They weren't biting. The host leaned back in his chair, clearly not happy with the direction the conversation was going. But he wasn't going to back down. I have to say, he said with a slight smirk, I'm impressed by how well you two are handling this. I expected a bit more fireworks. Sandra, now visibly annoyed, gave a small, knowing smile. We're professionals, she said, her voice dripping with the hint of sarcasm. We know what this is about. Keanu chuckled softly, the sound so calm that it almost felt out of place in the tense atmosphere. The thing is, he said, his voice low but clear, what people don't realize is that the media can only show you what they want you to see. But it doesn't change the fact that we're both human. We don't have to give in to the drama to be happy. The crowd, who had been nervously quiet for the past few minutes, suddenly erupted into applause. They weren't just clapping for the stars. They were clapping for the way Keanu and Sandra had handled the situation, with grace, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to truth. It was a refreshing change from the usual spectacle that often took place on these types of talk shows. The host, who had been so sure of his ability to push boundaries, now seemed a bit deflated. He stared at the two of them, clearly thrown off balance. He had expected them to crack under the pressure, to give him something juicy to work with. But instead, they had done the opposite. They had taken control of the narrative. Keanu gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Sandra, a gesture of quiet solidarity. Sandra, in turn, smiled back at him, grateful for his calm strength. The interview was no longer about their past films or the rumors that had surrounded them. It was about something deeper and about respect, friendship, and how they had learned to navigate the chaos of fame together. The host, sensing that the moment had passed, tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics. But the damage had already been done. The mood in the room had shifted. What had started as a probing, uncomfortable interview had turned into something else entirely. It had become a demonstration of how powerful silence, composure, and respect could be in the face of criticism. And as the show continued, Keanu and Sandra's responses became less about defending themselves and more about showing the world who they truly were. Not just the stars the media had painted them to be, but two people who had learned to stay true to themselves, no matter the pressure. The audience, still buzzing with energy, watched as the conversation shifted. The host, no longer able to continue with his antagonistic approach, softened a little. He asked them about their current projects, and they spoke with genuine enthusiasm about the things they were working on. The tone had finally shifted to something positive. But as the night wore on, one thing was clear. The real story wasn't about the questions the host had asked or the way he had tried to manipulate the conversation. It was about how Keanu and Sandra had stood their ground, showing the world the power of staying true to who you are, even when the world wants to pull you in 1,000 different directions. The show had taken a turn, but the tension in the air was still palpable. As much as the audience wanted to move on from the uncomfortable exchange, it felt as though the atmosphere had been permanently altered. The host, clearly frustrated by his inability to provoke a dramatic reaction, shifted in his seat. He glanced at his cue cards, searching for a way to regain control of the interview. But Keanu and Sandra weren't giving him the satisfaction. They had found their rhythm. They were calm, composed, and unwavering. They knew exactly how to handle a situation like this. It wasn't about creating drama or letting the media narrative take the wheel. They were in control, and it was becoming more and more apparent to the audience. For the next few moments, the host tried to recover from the awkwardness. He casually asked about their favorite on-screen moments from Speed, as if he were trying to pull the conversation back into safer waters. But Sandra's smile had faded. It wasn't that she didn't want to talk about the film. Of course she did. But it was clear that something more was at play now. Keanu answered first, talking about how much fun it had been working with Sandra. He shared a story from the set about a particularly nerve-wracking stunt, where the two of them had to jump from one moving vehicle to another. The audience laughed, and the tension in the room seemed to ease for a moment. But Sandra didn't join in the laughter. She had seen the shift in the tone of the conversation, and she wasn't about to pretend like everything was back to normal. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You know," she said, "it's strange. People think they know everything about us because they see us on screen or hear things through the media, but they don't see what it's like when the cameras stop rolling, or how hard we work to get where we are." She paused, looking directly at the host, as though making sure he understood the weight of her words. It's easy to throw around questions about drama and relationships, but that's not what defines us. It never was. The audience fell silent. This wasn't just a casual comment. It was a statement. Sandra wasn't just talking about the movie. She was talking about how people often misunderstood the real connection between her and Keanu, how their relationship had never been about gossip or rumors. It had always been about respect, mutual understanding, and shared experiences. Keanu nodded, his expression calm but serious. "Exactly," he said. "The media often tries to create a story where there isn't one. People want a scandal, a juicy detail, something to gossip about, but we've always kept things simple. We respect each other, and that's all that matters." The host looked as though he hadn't expected this kind of answer. He had wanted controversy, but instead he was being met with a level of maturity that left him momentarily speechless. He took a breath, trying to regain some of his earlier bravado, but the audience had already shifted their focus. The applause from moments before had died down, replaced by a quiet respect for what Keanu and Sandra were saying, but the host wasn't ready to let go of the narrative he had constructed in his head. He wasn't willing to accept that these two stars weren't interested in giving him the drama he wanted. He pressed on. "I see," he said, his tone shifting again, trying to be more casual. "But you have to admit, working so closely with someone for that long, there must have been a moment where you felt a little something more than just friendship." Sandra's jaw tightened slightly, and Keanu's gaze hardened. This wasn't an innocent question anymore. It wasn't a simple curiosity. It was a direct attempt to stir up something that didn't exist. And they both knew it. Sandra's voice was firm as she replied, "I don't think it's helpful to create these false narratives. People are entitled to their own stories, but that doesn't mean we have to live by them." She looked at Keanu for a moment, her expression softening. "We've both moved forward with our lives, and we've both built our careers based on who we are, not who people think we should be." The room seemed to hold its breath. The host, now caught off guard, tried to mask his discomfort with a forced laugh. "Oh, come on," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Everyone has a little bit of drama in their lives, right? Doesn't matter who you are. There's always something." Keanu didn't react immediately. He just sat there, his expression unreadable. Then, after a few seconds of silence, he spoke. "You're right," he said quietly. "Everyone has their own story. But not everyone needs to share it. Some things are private, and some things don't belong to anyone but the people involved." There was no mistaking the weight of his words. The host's smirk faltered as the room absorbed the truth in what Keanu had just said. The audience, sensing that they were witnessing something bigger than a simple interview, began to murmur in agreement. This wasn't just about answering questions. This was about standing up for one's own boundaries, about defining who you were, not letting others define you. Sandra smiled, but it wasn't the polite, carefully crafted smile that had appeared earlier in the interview. This one was different. It was genuine, a small victory for her and Keanu. "Exactly," she said. "We've been doing this for a long time, and we've learned a lot along the way. Not everything needs to be aired out for the world to see." The host sat back, his earlier smugness replaced with a look of realization. He had been so focused on getting a rise out of them, on turning this into a viral moment, that he had missed the point entirely. It wasn't about drama. It wasn't about rumors. It was about respecting people's boundaries and understanding that not everything was for public consumption. The rest of the interview passed in a much quieter tone. The host, no longer able to push for the tension he had hoped for, began to ask more open-ended questions. He asked about Sandra's recent projects, and Keanu shared some details about an upcoming film he was excited about. But it was clear that the mood in the room had shifted. There was a sense of mutual respect now. Sandra and Keanu had taken control of the narrative, and the host, though reluctant, had no choice but to follow their lead. The audience, which had once been on the edge of their seats, now seemed to settle into a quieter appreciation of what was unfolding. No one had expected the night to take this turn, but it had, and it was becoming evident that this wasn't just another celebrity interview. It was a moment where two people stood tall, refusing to let the world define their relationship for them. As the segment came to a close, the host thanked them for their time, but his words felt hollow. It wasn't the typical closing. It wasn't filled with the usual light-hearted banter. There was a weight to the silence that followed. The audience clapped, but this time it was different. They weren't clapping for a joke, a performance, or a rehearsed answer. They were clapping for what had just transpired, for the quiet strength that Keanu and Sandra had shown. When the camera cut to commercial, Keanu and Sandra stood up, their expressions softening. They exchanged a brief, knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. The host, still sitting at his desk, watched them quietly. He had wanted a scandal. He had wanted drama. But instead he had gotten something much more powerful, a lesson in dignity. As they left the set, the lights dimming behind them, there was a sense that the real story of the night wasn't about what had been said, but about what hadn't. The silence between the words had spoken louder than anything else. The lights of the talk show set faded behind them as Keanu and Sandra walked toward the exit. Their steps were synchronized, as if they'd rehearsed the movement, but there was no doubt in their minds that they hadn't. There was a shared understanding between them now, one that went beyond words. It was as though they had weathered a storm together, and the calm that followed had a weight to it that could not be ignored. Once they were out of the studio, the noise from the bustling crew and the clattering of equipment slowly faded. They were led into a small, quiet lounge area backstage. The air was different here, more relaxed, and yet there was still that lingering feeling of something unresolved. For all the calm in their demeanor on stage, the experience had stirred something deep inside both of them. Keanu leaned against a wall, folding his arms in his usual relaxed way. His eyes were thoughtful, as if he were processing everything that had happened. Sandra sat down on a nearby chair, the exhaustion from the interview showing on her face. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the weight of the conversation. But there was a smile in her eyes, a small private smile, as though she was proud of how they had handled themselves. "That was intense," Sandra said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in her words. "I didn't expect him to push that hard." Keanu chuckled, the sound deep and calm. "Yeah, I didn't either. But it's part of the game, I guess. People want the drama. They want the juice. But it's up to us whether we give it to them." Sandra nodded, her expression serious now. "I just hate that it always comes down to this. Every time we do an interview, there's always some part of it that feels like a game. They want us to play, and when we don't, well, that's when they start to get frustrated." Keanu took a step closer to her, his voice warm but steady. "It's easy for people to forget that we're real people too. They see us on screen and think they know everything about us, but there's so much more beneath the surface. Sandra's lips curved into a half-smile. I know exactly what you mean, but you've always been better at handling this than I am. Keanu shrugged. I don't know about that. I just try not to let it get to me. What's the point in feeding into something that isn't real? Sandra looked at him, her eyes full of appreciation. She had always admired Keanu's ability to remain grounded, especially in such a chaotic world. He had a way of finding peace, in the midst of the storm, something that she had always struggled with. I guess you're right, she said, her voice quieter now. It's just hard sometimes. People think they have a right to know everything about us, but there's so much we don't share, so much we can't share. Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. Exactly, and that's okay. Not everything needs to be out in the open. Some things are just for us, and we get to decide what we want to keep private. Sandra sat back, letting his words sink in. She had heard him say this before, of course, but today it felt different. Today, it felt more real. She had spent years in the spotlight navigating the pressures of fame, but she had never quite gotten used to the constant scrutiny. It was like living under a microscope where every little detail of your life was analyzed, dissected, and often misinterpreted. She thought back to the years she had spent with Keanu on set, the long hours, the endless rehearsals, the laughter between takes. What the world saw was the product of their hard work, but they didn't see what went on behind the scenes. The late-night conversations, the moments of vulnerability, the friendship that had developed between them. The media often painted their relationship as something more, something that wasn't there, and it had taken a toll on both of them. But now, in this quiet moment, Sandra felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was because for once she didn't feel the need to explain herself to anyone. Do you ever get tired of it? She asked suddenly, breaking the silence again. Tired of the questions, the rumors, the constant need for people to know everything about your life? Keanu's eyes softened as he looked at her. I think we all get tired of it at some point, but we can't control what people think. We can only control how we react to it. Sandra sighed. It's just exhausting sometimes. I get it, Keanu said gently. But remember, we've got each other. We've always had each other, and that's the most important thing. Sandra smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest at his words. I don't know what I'd do without you. They sat in silence for a while, just letting the weight of the conversation settle. It was rare for them to talk like this outside of the public eye, without the pressure of interviews or cameras around. It felt like a much-needed reset. But eventually the quiet was broken by the sound of a knock on the door. A producer entered the room, breaking the moment they had shared. Hey, just wanted to let you both know that the car is ready, he said, giving them both a polite smile. We'll be heading out soon. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a glance, both silently acknowledging that the interview had come to an end. As much as they had enjoyed the quiet, it was time to return to the chaos of the outside world. The world, where everyone had an opinion, where the spotlight never dimmed. Thanks, Sandra said, standing up. We'll be right there. Keanu nodded and followed her as they both walked toward the door. There was no need for more words. They both knew that the real world was waiting for them outside, with its demands, its expectations, and its constant need for attention. But for now they had each other, and that was enough. As they walked down the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoed around them. Sandra glanced over at Keanu, seeing the same quiet resolve in his eyes. There was something comforting in his presence, something steady and grounding. In a world where everything seemed to be constantly shifting, he was the constant. And that, she realized, was exactly what she needed. The car ride to their next destination was uneventful. The city lights flickered past the window as they drove in silence. Sandra leaned back against the seat, her mind wandering back to the moments backstage, to the conversation that had just taken place. She had been through a lot in her career, but there was something different about this. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly in control of her own narrative, and it was a liberating feeling. Keanu, as usual, remained quiet beside her, his eyes staring out the window. He didn't need to fill the silence with words. He had never been one for small talk. But that was one of the things Sandra appreciated about him, his ability to just be. There was no pressure with him. No need to explain, no need to perform. As the car rolled to a stop, they both knew that the next phase of the night would require them to step back into their roles. They would smile, make polite conversation, and continue the work they had come to love. But in this quiet moment, in the calm that followed the storm, Sandra couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the chance to speak her truth. Grateful for the friendship she had with Keanu. Grateful that, no matter how hard the world tried to pull them in different directions, they had found a way to stay grounded. Together. The night had wound down, and the energy around them shifted once again. The bustling of the crew, the flashing of cameras, and the steady hum of the outside world crept back in as Keanu and Sandra arrived at the next event. The brief silence in the car had been a welcome escape, but now they were back in the spotlight. They stepped out of the car, greeted by the flash of cameras and the shouting of photographers. For a moment, Sandra felt that familiar knot in her stomach, the moment when the world would judge her every move, her every expression. It had become second nature over the years, but the weight of it never quite disappeared. She adjusted her dress, pulling her shoulders back, and gave a polite smile. It wasn't a forced smile. It was just the one she had perfected after all these years. Keanu, as always, remained calm beside her. His face was serene, almost detached from the chaos around him. He never seemed rattled by the cameras or the attention. It was as though he had mastered the art of blending into the background, even when the world wanted him front and center. They walked the red carpet together, making small talk with reporters, but their minds were elsewhere. Despite the spotlight on them, they were still processing the earlier conversation, the tension that had come with being pushed into corners by a host who wanted more than they were willing to give. Sandra glanced at Keanu as they posed for a few more photos. "I didn't expect it to be this chaotic tonight," she said quietly, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Keanu's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and he gave a small, reassuring smile. "It's always like this, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm. "You get used to it after a while." Sandra chuckled softly, though it wasn't entirely genuine. "I don't know if I ever really get used to it," she admitted. "I think there's always a part of me that hopes it'll be different, that people will stop seeing us as just these characters, that we'll just be ourselves." Keanu gave her a thoughtful look, his expression softening. "I think a lot of people forget that we're just people. We have our lives, our struggles, our dreams, just like anyone else. The difference is that the world watches us do it." Sandra nodded. "Exactly. It's the constant gaze, the expectation to always be something. But sometimes I wish I could just go for a walk without someone taking a picture of me. Or have a quiet dinner without someone whispering about me. I don't want to be defined by what people think of me." Keanu's voice was steady, but it held a sense of understanding. "I get it. We've been under a microscope for so long it's hard to remember what it feels like to just exist without all the attention." They both fell silent for a moment, lost in their own thoughts. The world around them was loud, with cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. But the two of them had found their own moment of stillness, even amidst the noise. As they made their way inside the event, the noise of the crowd grew louder and the air shifted again. The evening had already taken a toll on Sandra, but she pushed through, engaging in conversations with other guests, shaking hands, and exchanging pleasantries. She smiled, nodded, and laughed at all the right moments, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but feel like something was missing, like she was playing a part that didn't quite fit her anymore. Keanu, too, seemed to be going through the motions. His conversations were polite but distant, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely. There was something about tonight that had left both of them feeling drained. It wasn't just the interview. It was the constant push and pull between who they were as people and who the world expected them to be. As the evening wore on, the event began to wind down. The guests started to filter out, the music slowing, the lights dimming. Keanu and Sandra found themselves standing by the exit, quietly watching the crowd. The pressure had lifted a little, but the unease lingered. Sandra turned to Keanu, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wish we could just disappear? Leave all of this behind?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He stared ahead, his eyes lost in thought. After a long pause, he finally spoke. I think about it sometimes. But then, I remember why we do this, why we keep going. We've built something good, something meaningful. And no matter how hard it gets, we can't just walk away from that. Sandra's gaze softened, and she looked down at the floor for a moment, as if contemplating his words. I know, she said, her voice steady. I know we've built something important, but it doesn't change the fact that sometimes I just want a break. A moment where I can breathe without all the noise. Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. We'll get there. Maybe not now, but someday. And until then, we have each other. We've always had each other. Sandra met his gaze, her eyes filled with gratitude. She had always known that Keanu was someone she could rely on, someone who understood her, who knew what it felt like to be pulled in a million directions and still try to hold on to who you really were. Their friendship had been the anchor in a world that was constantly shifting. And in moments like this, when everything felt uncertain, it was a reminder of the strength they shared. As they left the event, the crowd still buzzing around them, they found a quiet corner away from the madness. For a few moments, they were able to catch their breath, the weight of the night slowly beginning to lift. There was still the pressure of being in the public eye, of knowing that their every move would be analyzed, but at that moment, they didn't need to say anything. The unspoken bond between them was enough. I think we did good tonight, Sandra said, her voice tired but content. We stood our ground. Keanu smiled, that familiar, calm smile that always seemed to put her at ease. Yeah, we did, and we'll keep doing it, in our own way. They stood there for a while longer, just enjoying the quiet, away from the cameras, away from the chaos. For a brief moment, they could forget about the world outside and just be themselves. The pressures of fame, the constant noise, all faded into the background. And for that moment, they felt like they had truly reclaimed a piece of their own lives. Eventually, they were escorted to their car, the familiar routine settling back in. As they drove away from the event, the city lights passing by, Sandra found herself feeling a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from escaping the world. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing who you were and standing strong in that truth. Keanu, as usual, was quiet next to her, but she could feel the unspoken understanding between them. They didn't need to say anything more. They knew that no matter what the world threw at them, they would face it together. The car ride felt different now, less like a routine, more like a shared moment of reflection. There was no need for small talk or distractions. They had already said what needed to be said, and now they could just enjoy the quiet. And as they drove off into the night, Sandra knew one thing for sure. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many challenges lay ahead, she and Keanu would always have each other. And that in the end was all that mattered.